The 70s were a time of change in America. Coming out of the revolutionary and tumultuous times that had been incurred in the 1960s, they served as a time to pause and cement the cultural changes that had taken place. The peace movement had achieved its ultimate goal of withdrawing troops out of the civil war between North and South Vietnam. The gay rights movement would start to rise in popularity. The women's movement began to develop momentum in showing that women could be more than simply housewives. Richard Nixon would resign from presidential office as the Watergate scandal escalated and cost him his political and national support. And Studio 54 would become the most exclusive nightclub in the world. While the youth that had been active in ushering in this change in the 60s was beginning to grow and mature, so too was one of the bands that echoed their sentiments and drove forward their generation. The Beatles were without a doubt one of the most influential bands of all time, starting all the way back with their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964, which at the time offered America a much welcome distraction to the new world they were thrust into. A world of distrust, a world of anger, a world of confusion, a world without JFK, and a world without Camelot. But while the 70s served as a time for the country to reflect on all they had accomplished in the 60s and to move forward, so too did it serve as a time when the Beatles could look at all they had achieved and finally branch out to see what they could accomplish on their own. Nearly 10 years after the band had called it quits, Steve Lieber, a manager for many successful rock and roll bands with his partner David Krebs, including AC/DC, Def Leppard, and Aerosmith, was sitting with his kids talking about what their favorite bands were. Interestingly, he found that the Beatles came into discussion, and it got his mind racing about how the group could still have as strong of a grip on society as they had in their heyday. He went around to various radio stations and found that the amount of Beatles songs that were still being played in circulation was astonishing. Lieber knew that there wasn't a way to get the Beatles back together, and after spitballing with ideas of a concert series featuring Beatles songs, Lieber found himself meeting with Jules Fisher, who convinced him to throw his hat into Broadway for the first time by creating a show that perfectly encapsulated the 1960s, using the greatest music ever written. From this concept, the show Beatlemania started to take form, and Broadway would never be the same again. This is more than just a look into a Broadway show.
It's a look into how myself and three other young musicians from New York City in the 1970s answered a vague New York ad and wound up assuming the challenge of being one of the first to fill the huge shoes of one of the greatest bands of all time.
It's a look into how Broadway and New York as a whole began to change in the 1970s, from a gritty, run-down, near-forgotten place into the mecca of the theater arts world we know today.
And ultimately, it's a look into how the Beatles continued to influence not only my life, but the lives of an entire generation so long after their split. This is the forgotten history of Beatlemania on Broadway.
What broke up the Beatles? It's a question that's been debated for decades. Many are quick to jump to the relationship between John Lennon and Yoko Ono for being the main catalyst that led to the group's separation. She had clouded John's head, sabotaged the band, and manipulated him to leave. While that version seems like the most tempting answer, the truth is, the split of the Beatles was inevitable, with or without her involvement in the story. Yoko Ono didn't break up the Beatles. The Beatles broke up the Beatles. Tensions had been rising in the band for a while, starting all the way back with their work on the White Album in 1968. But those tensions came to a head in 1969. The Beatles were a year into a new company they had formed named Apple Corps, and despite one hit with Hey Jude, the company was proving to be a financial black hole, with Lennon himself even declaring that at the rate they were going, the Beatles were going to be broke in 6 months. This caught the attention of a man named Alan Klein, who had initially reached out to the band's former manager, Brian Epstein, in 1964 to sign them to a $2 million deal with RCA, which Epstein turned down, citing a loyalty to EMI Records. Lennon would go on to bring Klein on as his financial advisor, before eventually becoming the band's manager in 1969, much to the frustration of Paul McCartney, who would have preferred to have been represented by his wife Linda's father and brother. The band would continue to bicker and fight while working on an album titled Get Back, before ultimately shelving it in place of Abbey Road. On September 20th, just 6 days before Abbey Road's release, Lennon broke the news to the rest of the band. He was leaving. The band was shell-shocked. Still, desperate for another record from a group that was collapsing in on itself, as well as a way to fulfill the picture deal they had with United Artists, Klein decided to revisit the shelved Get Back album. It was renamed Let It Be, and after the album was released, all the members could tell that that was that. John wasn't going to be coming back to the group, and so McCartney decided it was time to tell the world. In April of 1970, Paul publicly released his plans to leave the Beatles. The breakup was difficult for all of the members of the band, but especially Paul and John. The two became embroiled in a feud, releasing songs targeting each other in the lyrics and claiming that they both had no interest in working with each other ever again. It was a tough time for the band, and for the fans who had been following them for so long, but it was truly inevitable. McCartney viewed the last 2 albums as looking at how the Beatles had come full circle. They wanted to make good music and conquer the world together, and they had done that. The real danger in achieving this was that they had always been the Beatles. They went as best friends from school performing at the Liverpool Cavern to instantly becoming the Beatles. They never had time to figure out who they were or what they could accomplish by themselves. There was nowhere else for them to go as a group. Lennon didn't want to become a comic strip version of the Beatles, being dragged on stage with a walker at the age of 50. George Harrison and Ringo Starr were coming into their own as songwriters and performers, and Paul McCartney was ready to grow up and start raising a family, something that he couldn't do dedicating all of his time to the band. Thus, it's not the question of who broke up the Beatles, but rather what broke up the Beatles, and that was tension, money, and ultimately, a yearning to grow. It's interesting how, even in their final act as a band, they still found a way to do what they had been doing their whole career. And that was reflecting the tone of their time. The disintegration from the optimistic, collaborative group of friends to a tense, distrusting partnership again mirrored what America would come to face during the 1970s, especially in New York City. Running with the new show concept that had been conceived with Jules Fisher and David Krebs, Steve Lieber was now faced with a near impossible task: finding a group of 4 men who could convincingly play the members of one of the biggest bands in history. Looking around today, Beatles tribute bands are commonplace, but back in the 70s, it was a brand new concept that many people felt was sacrilegious in a sense. The Beatles had only broken up a few years ago, and were still in their 30s performing their own solo shows. Anyone who tried to recreate them seemed to be ripping off their success. A small tribute band had popped up here and there, namely a little band in Laguna Beach, California named Rain. But other than that, it had never been seen on a large platform. Regardless, and before even securing the rights, Lieber sent musical directors Andrew Dorfman and Jack Carone to search the entire country for his new Fab Four, spending an incredible $250,000 in the process. The auditions? Well, they were interesting, to say the least. The producers weren't concerned with the lookalike qualities of the cast, but rather focused on natural charisma and overall musical talent. The auditions would bring in countless hopefuls, many without any musical training, but who were attracted to the idea of potentially being a Beatle for a day. In the end, it would prove to be an ad in a small New York newspaper and a phone call that would bring 4 unsuspecting people together.
Well, pretty good replica, but not the real thing, obviously. These youngsters, young men, have fans as well, but not nearly the kind of fans that the real Beatles had in their halcyon days.
In 1976, Justin McNeil, a young musician living in New York City, was looking through the local paper The Village Voice when he was drawn to an advertisement with Paul McCartney's face peeking over it. The listing was vague, simply stating, "For a unique experience, call. Beatle musicians or lookalikes wanted." This would prove to be the same ad that would instantly spark the interest of thousands of dreamers across the globe. McNeil was a graduate of the Long Island High School of Music and Art, where he had spent many years practicing the drums. He decided to take a bet on himself, and soon found himself in the SIR studios on 54th Street, in the midst of an abundance of extremely nervous Beatles lookalikes. The musical director, Kenny Laguna, soon entered the room, and everyone went quiet. Laguna posed a simple yet imposing question. Who wants to audition first? McNeil had been playing Beatles songs since he had first seen their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and felt little apprehension in performing their songs. McNeil took his place with a few other brave souls, and he soon found himself on a stage with a young guitar player named Leslie Fratkin. At only 25 years old, Leslie already had extensive experience in the music industry, including work with MGM, and releasing a single called Song of a Thousand Voices, which was given front page coverage in Billboard magazine and earned it a spot on the top 40. During a recording session, Fratkin came across the same advertisement in The Village Voice, and after auditioning one-on-one with Laguna, he was cast on the spot. McNeil instantly jumped into his audition, playing drums for Lady Madonna and mixing in the vocals on the song with a little help from my friends. Laguna had a big task ahead of him. Nearly 2,000 Beatles hopefuls were auditioned, and that number needed to be dwindled down to 4. While the Village Voice ad would go on to help with finding 3 of the 4 Beatles for the show, it would be a different path that would help Laguna find the face of Beatlemania. Mitch Weissman was in his apartment in New York City when he received a phone call from a friend who had worked at Sam Ash Music in Long Island.
He told me that he had seen a flyer saying that they were looking for musicians, Beatle lookalikes, for a unique opportunity. Upon being told this, I instantly made a decision. There was no way I was going. I was scared to death. Despite being a performer on stage and in bands, I was basically very shy. It was actually my friend who was visiting from Pittsburgh who leapt to his feet and yelled, "You're going," and proceeded to basically drag me down to audition. Unlike Justin's audition, where the room was filled with people waiting to audition, I was in the room with only 2 other people and my acoustic guitar. I was asked to do 2 songs, a fast song and a ballad. I performed a quarter of both, Get Back and Yesterday. While I was performing, I noticed that there was a man who was scribbling notes furiously, leading me to believe that I was blowing the audition and was destined to receive a huge amount of notes. In my head, I was thinking, I knew I shouldn't have come. When I was actually able to look at the notebook, however, I found the same sentence had been scribbled over and over. Looks just like Paul, sounds close. The man writing the notes would turn out to be Kenny Laguna. Another guy who had arrived at the auditions, however, also had Paul in his sights, and that man was Joe Pecorino, who years later went on to become the musical director of Hedwig and The Angry Inch. Joe had been kicking around the music industry for a while like the rest of us, with varying degrees of success, and ultimately decided it would be funny to see a huge flock of people dressed up as the various Beatles throughout the years. Needless to say, he was extremely disappointed when he arrived at the audition to find that he was the only person in the room. Auditioning for the role of McCartney, he initially sang a couple of his songs. Joe was invited back, and soon he found himself in the mix with roughly 40 to 50 other musicians. This was how the audition process was different for Joe, Leslie, and me. While Justin showed up for the later cattle calls, we auditioned when it was still based on time slots, meaning it was just us at first, and only after our small auditions would we go on to audition with a bigger crowd. At one point during one of these group auditions, Joe was sitting on a couch in the rehearsal hall without his glasses on, and he saw me about 30 feet away from him, prompting him to exclaim, "Wait a minute, what's McCartney doing here?" Soon all the roads converged, and the four of us found ourselves in an elimination process that lasted 3 days. And thus, as quickly as the search had started, it had ended. After mixing and matching multiple artists, and despite holding auditions all around the globe, the producers had found their Fab Four in the Big Apple. The final lineup would include Justin McNeil as Ringo Starr, Les Fracken as George Harrison, and me, Mitch Weissman, as Paul McCartney. While Joe Pecorino might not have gotten the role he auditioned for, he still found himself front and center as John Lennon. Not exactly a bad trade-off. Soon, we all met the producer Steve Lieber and hoped that we would finally get some answers to what we had just auditioned for. All we knew was that we were getting paid $250 a week, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week to play Beatles songs. When we asked Lieber what this was all for, he still wouldn't tell us. The reason? Lieber didn't know what we were doing either.
Once the cast has been finalized, the next obstacle in the production took place. Sure, they had the principal roles, but now they needed to make them actually sound like the Beatles. This led to the question amongst the group of, what should they sound like? The Beatles hadn't toured since 1966, after generally losing joy from the travel, and amid the controversy following John Lennon declaring that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus. With this in mind, the cast decided to do a hybrid of the two, watching and listening to bootlegs of live concert footage, and also carefully dissecting the Beatles albums, attempting to mimic the flaws and hiccups that made the original recordings so unique.
We all converged and started rehearsing in July of 1976 at SIR Studios, with the plan being to open the show in September. Together, we rehearsed for roughly 4 to 6 hours a day, and by the time September arrived, the show got pushed back to October, then November, then December, and so on. While this was great for giving us more time to rehearse, we still had one major problem. We still weren't sure which songs were going to be in the final production. So what was the answer to not knowing which songs to rehearse? Rehearse them all. In all, we amassed a catalog of nearly 300 Beatles songs as a result of not knowing which ones were going to be picked. It was only once the actual rehearsal run drew closer that it was narrowed down to 70, then 40, and then finally 36.
While the cast was in music rehearsals, the production team was faced with challenges of their own. How do they translate the turbulent decade of the 1960s into a stage show? The last thing they wanted was to present a by-the-numbers retelling of the Beatles story, and instead wanted to keep the audience on their toes, never knowing what would be coming next. What resulted was one of the most technically advanced productions that the theater world had ever seen. Beatlemania was, in a sense, one of the first musicals to really capitalize on creating a sense of spectacle by creating a 2-hour visual collage of lights, slides, and film. This consisted of over 10,000 separate slides that were programmed through 28 channels that were then fed into a 40-channel expander to allow for cuts between images that dissolved at varying speeds. The production required 15 xenon slide machines placed in front scrims and near rear screens. They also had 4 incandescent projectors for the side screen, 2 16mm motion picture film projectors, 9 effect projectors, and a set which used over 200 lights. These tools would all be used to move the story forward, showing archived footage from the time period, including rare clips of Martin Luther King Jr. Still images and state-of-the-art projections also helped to evoke a mood for each song, and with distinguishing the time periods in which the Beatles songs were influenced, and vice versa. While these types of special effects and this sense of spectacle have become commonplace in many current theater productions, like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, and especially Spider-Man.
Come on, New York City! Let's get your freak on!
At the time, these were effects that had never really been seen on a theater stage, and were added in part thanks to Krebs, Lieber, and Fisher's experience from working on creating concert experiences. The show ended up having over 4,000 cues, and were all controlled by one person. Talk about stress. By the time that the curtain was ready to go up, the crew consisted of over 40 artists, designers, researchers, photographers, film editors, programmers, and technicians, all of whom were dedicated to creating an immersive experience that accurately depicted the feelings of key events from the 1960s. The effects alone proved to be an innovation in stage. But once the band was introduced, all bets were off.
Unlike popular jukebox musicals like Mamma Mia, where the dialogue and story are shaped around the songs, oftentimes resulting in numerous dance numbers, Beatlemania was unique in that it wasn't a jukebox musical. Instead, it was a concert with a story and themes, so much so that occasionally audience members would rush onto the stage only to be escorted off by security. The 60s were an era that defined the generation in which huge cultural shifts and earth-shattering events took place. The reason so many people look back at the 60s as one of the most important decades in American history is due to how rapidly the entire landscape of a society changed. The kids of the 1950s were starting to come of age, and a sense of unrest was beginning to build amongst them as they surveyed the world in which they were living. Questions regarding the virtues of a post-World War II society were beginning to grow, and the rock and roll music of the time began to reflect this. Beatlemania was not a story about the Beatles, it was a story about the 60s.
The show would start with the guitar strums of songs such as Let's Twist Again and Bye Bye Lover, showcasing the beauty of Camelot in America. John F. Kennedy had taken the country by storm with his youth, elegance, and charm. A dreamlike moment in history that would be forever changed on November 22nd, 1963, when his assassination would turn what seemed to be the most optimistic of times into the most turbulent.
Well, that was a very quick look, because we don't want to give too much of it away. Right. So let me introduce you to our guest this morning. First, Mitch Weissman. And when you take a look at Mitch Weissman, you will understand why he is in a show entitled Beatlemania.
And you can tell me later.
A huge video from the performance that officially kicked off Beatlemania was projected onto a large screen on the front of the stage, with Ed Sullivan starting to introduce the band. This large screen would then fall down to show Ed on a small television screen until the Beatles would finally emerge, jumping feet first into She Loves You, to which the audience, filled mainly with young girls, would begin to scream at the top of their lungs. The show would continue chronologically through the time period, showcasing the numerous protests in the streets, the ongoing crisis in Vietnam, the deaths of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, the advancement of space exploration, and the politics of Richard Nixon. Over the course of 2 hours, the audience would be transported from the fantasy era of the 1960s James Bond movies to the political turmoil and psychedelic nature of the later moments of the decade. The tumultuous times of the 1960s were perhaps best captured in the show's Revolution sequence, in which the song was accompanied by footage of the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention, Nixon, and an incredible showcase of the numerous protest movements of the time. The version of Revolution had been slightly changed from the original Beatles recording, increasing in intensity until the entire theater was drenched in a climax of dark red light. The set list for the show was so intense that it was decided that a backup band would be needed when the band would inevitably be working 8 days a week, with the inclusion of a matinee. The show would include a total of 36 Beatles songs, but the Beatles were never mentioned past the Ed Sullivan clip at the beginning of the show. Their images were never projected on screen, and besides some on-stage show banter between the bandmates, the Beatles never spoke any dialogue. Ultimately because the show wasn't about that, and it didn't need to be. This show was about the power of the music, all of which was performed live, both by the band on stage and with an orchestra off stage, which proved to be one of the most difficult elements to nail in the show. As stated before, the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, meaning that a large amount of the songs performed live in the show had only ever existed in record form. The Beatles had never even attempted to perform them live. This left Andrew Dorfman to transpose and arrange all of the parts of the percussion, horns, and strings. There was no sheet music, so Dorfman had to do it entirely by ear, listening to the songs over and over again, constantly finding something new in the intricacies and slight imperfections of the music. In the case of the song All You Need Is Love, the ending saw the use of tape loops on the record, meaning Dorfman had to physically count out and write down the rhythms in a way that the musicians could read. Just when he thought that he had it right, he would re-listen to the same song a month later and realize that he had missed something, leading to him having to revise the entire thing. Dorfman did such a detailed and precise composition that the audience would often think they were just using tracks, since the orchestra was never seen on stage, much to the vexation of Dorfman. Beatlemania would have its world premiere at the Colonial Theater in Boston in April of 1977. Initially, the critics panned the show, complaining about the static nature of simply seeing the band hold its familiar positions for the entire runtime, and the overtly imitative nature of the performance. But when looking at it objectively, the show was never meant for the critics. Beatlemania was a show for the fans, and to quote Multimedia Magazine, the kids ate it up like Topps bubblegum. The show would take some time to fine-tune the performance before ultimately moving to the Winter Garden Theater in May of 1977. To add legitimacy to the production, Lieber and Krebs brought on board one of the first DJs the Beatles had welcomed into their inner circle, Murray the K, and he would be a special consultant. They also embarked on an advertising blitz to help drum up curiosity around the show in the New York metropolitan area, specifically striking up a deal with Coca-Cola, which offered discount tickets for every 6 bottle caps collected. Taking into account the critical reviews in Boston, producers circumvented this issue by ingeniously postponing the official opening and instead inviting audience members first to record their testimonials on the show.
It was like living my childhood again.
When the show finally did open on Broadway, the reviews were again mixed, but the commercial reception was through the roof. The audiences for Beatlemania were unique in that many people coming to the show were kids who had never gotten to see the Beatles live. Kids of all different religions, backgrounds, and skin color were all converging on the Winter Garden Theater for the chance to see, not the Beatles, but an incredible simulation. This was important, as it would go on to demonstrate the important role that Beatlemania played in a Times Square renaissance that was beginning to take hold. Broadway has become more than just a street in New York. It's come to reflect a certain state of mind. A mind of whimsy, dreams, and inspiration that's only rivaled by that of Disneyland. Families from around the globe converge on the Great White Way, as it's one of the most must-do activities when visiting New York. In the 70s, however, it was a much different story. Whereas the New York many people know today is mainly reserved for upper-middle-class people of means, 40 years ago, it was on the brink of a collapse. Son of Sam was terrorizing the city with a string of serial murders. The subways were covered with graffiti, and everyone would ask their taxi drivers to wait to pull away until they had safely made it inside their homes. The stock market crash of 1969 hit the city hard, and it was on the verge of bankruptcy. President Gerald Ford had denied the federal assistance requested, leading to the infamous Daily News headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." Broadway was regarded as a gritty vaudeville territory that few people felt safe spending time at. Drugs and prostitution reigned supreme, and it seemed as though Broadway was destined to fold. That is, until the late 70s hit. In 1977, a small marketing firm was commissioned by the city to create a campaign to help with increasing tourism. As a result, the now famous I Love New York campaign began, and signaled the beginning of a rebirth in the city. It was from this campaign that the idea of Broadway began to be promoted. Television ads began to emerge, with actors from the various shows performing the I Love New York jingle, in an attempt to save the industry they all loved. 3 men named Jimmy Netherland, Gerald Schoenfeld, and Bernie Jacobs also took the lead in trying to redefine the appeal and overall quality of the shows that were taking place in the theaters. Consequently, in the mid-70s, a string of hits began to emerge, specifically in the year 1977. Shows like Annie, Jesus Christ Superstar, and The King and I signaled a change in the presentation and the demographics Broadway was striving to appeal to. Perhaps one of the greatest shows that rarely receives the credit it deserves in helping to demonstrate this enhancement in quality was Beatlemania. With the nature of the show and the music that was recreated by the four fantastic musicians, Beatlemania helped in restoring a sense of community to Broadway audiences. It created a fun environment where it didn't matter where people came from or what hardships had hit them. It gave them an opportunity to escape from reality for a moment and just enjoy the music that had been instrumental in many of their lives. But while the opinions of the critics and the audiences had been well documented, there were still four opinions that had yet to be accounted for. What did the Beatles think of Beatlemania?
Beatlemania wasn't only controversial in its recasting of the four lads from Liverpool, but also in that it wasn't officially authorized by the Beatles. Over the course of the show, there was an unpredictability amongst the show's producers as to whether or not the Beatles' lawyers would become involved. The problem wasn't the performance rights of the songs, but rather the show as a whole. As expected, the media jumped on this fact, but Lieber held strong in the legality of the production, stating, "Had they been able to stop me, they would have," a comment that would soon come to haunt him. One of the first Beatles to respond to the musical was Ringo Starr, who started doing a round of interviews in which he criticized the show, saying that whoever was ripping off the Beatles would get theirs in the end. And Paul McCartney even considered taking legal action against the production, believing that the production had ripped off the Beatles' name.
Regardless, the producers and cast tried to put this behind them, and soon the show continued to grow. Beatlemania was as strong as it had ever been, and people were desperate to see the incredible simulation that they had heard so much about. So much so that at one point there were at least 7 sanctioned iterations positioned around the country and the globe, in such places as Los Angeles, Chicago, and even London. The show would continue to perform to raucous crowds, including an impromptu acoustic candlelight version during the New York blackout of 1977. The show would jump between the Luntfontein and Palace Theater. In 1978, once the cast moved to the Palace, William Sargent, an ambitious entrepreneur whose numerous proposed but often unrealized promotions included a closed-circuit fight between a man and a great white shark, took over from Lieber and Krebs as the lead producer. He was a charismatic force, and the Beatlemania cast was happy to have him on board. The show would continue to run for roughly 1 more year, before Sargent encountered his own money problems. Soon the money issues became too much for Sargent, and in October of 1979, Beatlemania closed on Broadway, after 2 years and 1,000 performances. The show would continue to be performed across the country, on a national tour, a bus and truck concert series, and even in the form of a movie adaptation of the stage production. But soon, the Beatles company Apple Corps would successfully win an injunction on the production in 1986. The reason for the injunction wasn't based off of copyright infringement, however, but rather on right of publicity, with Apple stating that the show was robbing the band members of their public personas that they had spent years carefully crafting. The litigation closed with Apple being awarded with roughly $40,500,000. Though this may sound like a lot of money, Beatlemania had made an astonishing $182 million off of a budget of about $4 million. All of those numbers have been adjusted for inflation. One incredibly revelatory fact about the case came to light after the conclusion of the litigation in 1986, when John Lennon's sworn deposition was brought to light. Lennon stated, "I and the 3 former Beatles have plans to stage a reunion concert." The reunion in question was to be named The Long and Winding Road, which was to be staged due to a resurgence of popularity for the Beatles and in Lennon's desire to recreate the musical magic of the early years with his friends. Yoko Ono said that he felt that they had traveled different paths for long enough. He felt they had grown up and were mature enough to try writing and recording new songs. It was going to be a one-night performance that would serve as the finale to a documentary that was to be released in the mid-80s. Sadly, this reunion never became a reality, as Lennon gave his deposition just 10 days prior to his murder outside of the Dakota Apartments in New York. Beatlemania deserves its title as one of the most ambitious shows in Broadway history. Despite being widely forgotten by the public, its contributions to the Beatles' mythos and the technical aspect of theater is still being felt to this day. Beatles tribute bands have become a staple of live performance entertainment, with that same little Laguna Beach band Rain continuing to produce shows across the country. And projections have become an integral element of storytelling in many hit musicals like Next to Normal and Dear Evan Hansen. These technological advancements wouldn't have come to be as prominent as they are today if it hadn't been for the ambitious mind of Jules Fisher ushering in their use. The show helped in adding legitimacy and a safe, fun environment to a Broadway that had become infamous with drugs and crime.
It also provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for 4 up-and-coming musicians who went from answering an ad for a unique opportunity to playing for thousands of people and being able to experience a little slice of what it's like to be a Beatle. Don't get me wrong, while Beatlemania may have just been an incredible simulation of the Fab Four, it still unintentionally captured the spirit of the Beatles in its means of innovation, experimentation, and growth, showing that even Broadway was ready for a much-needed revolution.
Good night, and to all of you in the audience, drive